Welcome back to Dave Stubbs, NHL.com columnist. And Dave, you're working on a story on the Stanley Cup. And we've reached that point in time with the Stanley Cup where something unique happens to it. Explain.
Something's got to give, right? I pitched an idea to my boss back around the NHL Awards in Las Vegas. I said the top band of the Stanley Cup is being retired. Ooh. So we're talking about the teams from 53, 54, the Detroit Red Wings, to the 1964, 65 Montreal Canadiens. So there are 12 teams on that top band. And when Louis Saint-Jacques, who's the engraver of the Stanley Cup in Montreal, actually puts the Washington Capitals on a new band, the top band comes off, will be retired to the Hall of Fame vault, facing the original Stanley Cup of Lord Stanley of Preston that he donated to Canada as the Dominion Challenge Cup. And we will have a fresh band on the bottom, so we're taking away a ton of great names.
I was just going to say, looking at the list of teams that are coming off, legendary names, not just good names. I mean, some of the best to ever play this game.
Yeah, Alex Delvecchio, Gordie Howe, Mr. Hockey comes off. Ted Lindsay, 93, the oldest living Stanley Cup champion. Glenn Hall, Mr. Goalie, 502 consecutive games played, 552 games with the playoffs. The Montreal Canadiens, Butch Bouchard, Bernie Boom Boom Geoffrion, Doug Harvey, Jacques Plante, who pioneered the goalie mask, scoring it into a game for the first time on the 1st of November, 1959. Saving stitches and teeth for goaltenders for generations.
Game changer.
And Maurice the Rocket Richard won 8 Stanley Cups and really was the fire in the belly of the Montreal Canadiens' fabulous dynasty from 1956 to 60.
Yeah, I know this is inevitable because we can't have a Stanley Cup that's, 15 feet tall or anything like that, but this bothers me a little.
You're sad. You have been sad all day.
I'm a little, when I hear that Gordie Howe's name, Maurice Rocket Richard's name, among all those great names that we've just mentioned, will no longer be on the Stanley Cup. It just does strike me as odd.
I don't know if it'll make you feel any better that Ted Lindsay, terrible Ted Lindsay, is okay with the fact that
if Ted is
Glenn
okay,
Hall, Mr. Goalie. But you know what? The beauty about the Stanley Cup is it's an organic trophy. So it lives and it breathes. It's really a sterling museum, and for the names that you add, names ultimately are going to come on. So, as I say, the top band...
The times they are changing a little bit. It's kind of like a change.
So at least there are only 12 teams coming off this top band, because that's an anomaly in itself. Normally there are 13 teams around on the band, but for some reason that no one can explain, the 1964-65 Canadiens take up 2 spaces on that band. No one knows why. It was not a French-Canadian Montreal Canadiens fan who carved that or put that team in there.
No conspiracy?
Yeah, no conspiracy at all. But
that we know of.
That's right.
That we know of. That's right. Well said.
Yeah.
And they had both names on there too. That's why they take up so much room, right? They had their first name and the whole thing, right?
Exactly right. Yeah. So the Stanley Cup, if you could actually take it today and melt it down, you would get about $8,000 on today's silver market.
Wow.
It's $14.50, I think, an ounce for gold or silver rather, and it's the Stanley Cup weighs 34.5 pounds. Yeah. But it's priceless. You look at the history on that cup, and I've spent a lot of time. I've been very privileged to be able to stop and look at the cup and look at some of the names that are on there. And I've seen players, I've seen alumni, gentlemen who've won this cup, put a piece of paper over their team and run a pencil over it and trace their name off it and literally be in tears as they did that. And they said they were doing this with their grandchildren. So you cannot...
Keep it alive, right?
Yeah, you cannot quantify what the Stanley Cup means.
My goodness. Well, you are just like a well of knowledge when it comes to a lot of topics around the National Hockey League. But this one's super interesting. And we talked about a lot of these little stories that people might not know about. One that really struck me was about the Toronto Maple Leafs. And with the removal of this ring, moving forward, the Leafs have how many years to win a cup before they're not on it at all?
The 1967 Leafs are on the next band of the Stanley Cup, so they have until 2031 to win the cup, or they are off. So
completely.
No pressure.
A lot of pressure on Austin Matthews, John Tavares, the whole group up there. Yep, Mike Babcock will get it done. Get it done for you, Dave.
You have till 2031 to win the Stanley Cup, or you're off. That's right. Yeah.
Wow.
So it's an amazing thing, actually, when you look at the cup and you see how much has gone on. You just look at the history. There's so many stories. There was a story about a photographer named James Rice, who was one of the first photographers of the cup, really, back in the probably early 20th century. He had the Stanley Cup in his studio in Montreal, photographed probably the Montreal Maroons or some team with it, and said, you know what, let's just finish with a picture and off we go. They couldn't find the Stanley Cup in the fall. They're looking around to find it. He turns to his wife and he says, have you seen the cup? I left it here. It's this small sterling silver bowl. And she said, oh, wait, is this it? And they went in the kitchen and it was on the windowsill and it was being used as a geranium planter. She had no idea that this was a Stanley Cup. And she was friends with the caretaker of a cemetery in Montreal who sent her geranium, so she thought this was the most beautiful planter in the world. So, I mean, the cup has been drop-kicked into the Rideau Canal in Ottawa. It has been left on sidewalks and picked up. It's probably going to take Louise...
lived a very storied life.
It's going to take Louise Saint-Jacques a month just to get Alexander Ovechkin's fingerprints off.
That's true.
Like,
There's going to be a lot of scrubbing.
Yeah, a lot of DNA on that trophy.
I want to ask you about an individual, like one of the great players, Hall of Famer, who was on the Stanley Cup, Frank Mahovlich. And in all your research, you come across some interesting things. And you had a really interesting story about this particular photograph.
I found this photograph. This was taken by Nat and Lou Turovsky, who were great newspaper photographers in probably the 1920s, 30s, 40s, and 50s. This is Frank Mahovlich, and he was actually in the dressing room of Maple Leaf Gardens. There was a telephone, a rotary dial phone behind him on the wall. I blew the photograph up and found the phone number on it. So I thought, what the heck? So I called the number, and some guy answered the phone. I said, yeah, hi, is Frank Mahovlich there? And I was met with silence, and I said, well, the Big M, you know, 6 Stanley Cups, you know, he sat in the Canadian Senate for years. I mean, Hall of Famer, 1981. Totally drew a blank, kept going on and on. So the thing that drove me crazy is when I finally hung up after having educated this young man about who Frank Mahovlich was, why didn't I call back an hour later and say, hi, this is Frank Mahovlich. Has anyone called for me?
Any messages? Yeah.
I should have. How do I miss that opportunity,
I know.
right?
Hey, it's not too late.
Yeah, but all of these photographs that I've been going through, it's been this incredible walk down memory lane for me because I'm 61. In 1967, I'm 10 years of age. I'm really starting to love hockey. And in the Montreal Star, they had a color supplement called Weekend Magazine, and the late Frank Prazak took photos in there. I had pictures of his on my bedroom wall at home. They were just spectacular. I mean, the way they were lit, the strobes off the glass, you could see the depth of the snow on the skates. And in my research for this series, which starts 21st of September, goes to the 2nd of October, 12 days in a row on NHL.com, I'm finding pictures that I had taped on my bedroom wall as a kid.
Wow.
And I literally was weak in the knees. I mean, it was quite emotional to find these. And I was spending a lot of time going through Photoshop and various programs to clean them up because the negatives were dirty. But to do all this has really been an absolute labor of love. And to put this together and to pay tribute and celebrate these gentlemen, these champions, there are 340 names on that band, 249 are players. And for these gentlemen, and Marguerite Norris, who was a woman, the owner, the president of the Red Wings, to have these names coming off is a huge thing for all of us, I think.
Well, you exude passion just talking about it, and we really appreciate you coming on. I mean, the stories are endless. He's been telling stories basically all day leading up to this show, but it is a series. What is the next item on your to-do list for this series? What's the next part for you?
Well, I have an essay that I'll be doing. In fact, next week I'm taking a plane and I'm flying out to Stony Plain, Alberta, and I'm going to go out. I have a long-standing invitation with Mr. Goldie Glenn Hall, who's a dear friend of mine. I'm going to go out. He will meet me on his front porch with a can of cold beer in his hand, and we're going to sit for 2 days and drink beer, and I'm going to listen to stories, and maybe one of every 100 stories that Glenn tells me I'll be able to repeat, but I'll work them into some of the what I write for the series.
Well, listen, I speak for myself and DJ, I think, when I say I'm very jealous of what you've got planned. Have a great time. The series is going to be amazing. Make sure you check it out. I can't wait to read all about it. Thanks again.
Thanks for having me come in.